She was 19 years old, and she had nothing left to her name but the coat on her back, the worn leather satchel over her shoulder, and for crumpled dollar bills she had pressed flat against her thighs so many times they had gone soft as cloth. Her name was Corinne Aldices, and by the autumn of 1903, the man who had called himself her guardian, her father's eldest brother, Warren Aldices, had signed away the last of her father's estate with a forged signature and a handshake in a county clerk's office she had never been allowed to enter. He had done it on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she was standing in the mud outside the house she had grown up in, watching a stranger load her mother's rocking chair into a wagon. She walked 12 miles south along the Oregon Coast Road before the blisters on her feet made her stop at the edge of the small harbor town of Pelican Spit, where a faded auction notice tacked to a post office board announced that a decommissioned Lighthouse on Calro Point had been declared surplus property by the state and would be sold, ASI's to the first willing buyer for $4 and no cents. People laughed when they read it. The structure was half-eaten by salt rot, they said. The lens had been removed. The steps were treacherous. It sat on a thumb of rock at the end of a crumbling causeway, surrounded by cold Pacific water, useful to no one. Corinne Aldices read that notice 3 times, counted her $4, and walked to the county registrar's window before she had any real reason to think it wise. What she did not know, what none of the laughing townspeople knew, was that someone had been inside that lighthouse a long time before her, and what they had left behind in the beacon room at the top of the tower would not only change Corinne's life, but would reach back through 20 years of silence to restore something an entire community had believed was gone forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Corinne Aldices. If you are watching from a place that feels forgotten, a place where the world seems to have moved on without you, tell us about it in the comments. Because this story is for you. Corinne had not always been poor, though she had never been what anyone would call wealthy. Her father, Thomas Aldices, had been a timber surveyor for most of his working life, a quiet and meticulous man who spent his weeks in the coastal forests north of Pelican Spit, measuring growth rings and recording the ages of trees with the same steady devotion other men gave to scripture. He carried a field notebook in his breast pocket at all times, a habit his daughter inherited, and he spoke in a way that made you feel the sentences had been selected carefully before they left his mouth, the way a craftsman selects the right chisel before making the first cut. He had married late to a woman named Ida, who had come down from Portland with a crate of books and a talent for growing things in salt-heavy soil that no one believed could support a kitchen garden. Between them, Corinne's parents had built a life that was modest but whole, a cedar-sided house on a low hill above the harbor, a root cellar that stayed cool and dry through August, bookshelves in every room, and the particular kind of peace that comes when 2 people have agreed on what matters. Corinne was born the only child of this arrangement, which meant she grew up in the company of adults and learned early to be comfortable with long silences and concentrated attention. Her mother taught her to tend plants, to press seeds between damp paper, to read the color of a leaf, for what it wanted. Her father taught her to observe, to write down what she saw, and to distrust conclusions that arrived too easily. He had a saying he returned too often: "The ledger never lies, Corey, but the man reading it might." She did not understand it fully when she was small, but she wrote it in her own field notebook anyway, in careful letters on the first page, because her father said it in the voice he reserved for things that were true. She was 15 when her mother died, a swift, unkind illness that took hold in March and did not release its grip, and 13 months later when her father followed. Not from grief exactly, though grief had made him careless, but from a fall on a wet ridgeline. In November, a fall no one witnessed, and that the other surveyors found the evidence of only 2 days after the fact. The county declared Thomas Aldis's estate worth enough to provide for his daughter's schooling and keep, provided a suitable guardian was named to manage it until she turned 21. Warren Aldis's, who had arrived from Portland smelling of bayrum and wearing new boots, presented himself as the obvious choice. He wept at the funeral in a way that appeared genuine. The county judge was satisfied. What Corinne knew of Warren, even then, was limited to the story her father had told once. Carefully, without bitterness, Warren had borrowed money from their father twice, and had not repaid it, and the two brothers had not spoken in several years before Thomas moved to the coast. Her father had not forbidden her from knowing her uncle, only observed that a man who repays a debt with silence is a man whose word you should weigh before you trust it. She was 15 and grieving, and she had no other family, and so she accepted Warren's guardianship with the simple arithmetic of someone who has no other option. She would regret it for years before she stopped regretting it and started building something else instead. For 4 years, Warren managed the estate from Portland, sending small sums on an irregular schedule, ignoring her letters, and responding to her requests for an accounting with brief notes that said everything was in order. She boarded with a widow named Mrs. Featherstone in Pelican Spit, who charged very little and asked very few questions, and she worked at the dry goods store 3 days a week and read everything she could find the other 4, and she waited. For 21, with the patience of someone who has learned that impatience costs more than it returns, she kept her father's field notebook. She kept her mother's seed catalogs. She kept the saying on the first page, "The ledger never lies, Corey." But the man reading it might. The end came on a Tuesday, as endings sometimes do, without sufficient warning. Corinne received a letter from a Portland solicitor named Gant, written in the compact language of legal men, informing her that the property formerly held in trust for Corinne Marie Aldis's had been duly transferred by consent of guardian to a buyer known as the Pacific Coastal Land Association, and that the proceeds had been applied to satisfy outstanding debts accrued on behalf of the estate, and that the trust, now having no remaining assets, was hereby dissolved. It was signed by Gant, countersigned by Warren, and witnessed by 2 men whose names she did not recognize. At the bottom, in a postscript that she would read and reread on the walk south until the words lost their meaning, it said that as the beneficiary had not yet reached the age of majority, her consent had not been required. She sat on Mrs. Featherstone's kitchen step for a long time after reading it, watching the fog come in off the water in slow rolling sheets. She did not cry. She had cried for her mother and her father, and that had used up a great portion of what she had for grief, and what was left was something flatter and harder, more like the quality of granite than of water. She thought about her father's saying. She thought about ledgers. She thought about what it meant that she had seen no accounting in 4 years and had accepted the silence, because she had no legal standing to demand otherwise. She thought about what a forged signature looked like versus a genuine one, and whether she could ever prove the difference, and how much money it would cost to find out, and how much money she had. And the answer to the last question was what made her stand up and go inside and put her things in her sock-heel. She did not say goodbye to Mrs. Featherstone, who was not home, but she left a note, and for months' worth of pressed wildflowers she had been collecting since spring, because she thought the widow would like them and because she wanted to leave. Something behind that was not the impression of a girl who had been robbed and abandoned. She walked out of town heading north first, then turned back south. Because north led to Portland, and Portland led to Warren, and Warren led to nothing she could reach with $4 and a satchel and no legal standing until she was 21. South led to Pelican Spit, and Pelican Spit led to the notice on the post office board. And the notice led to $4, and $4 was exactly what she had. It was a 30-minute walk, and the fog had thickened, and the light over the harbor had gone the color of old pewter, and she was very hungry. And by the time she reached the county registrar's window, she had not eaten since the previous morning, and she was shaking slightly in a way she hoped was only the cold. The registrar was a small, round man named Pritchett, who looked at her, then at the notice she placed on his counter, then at her $4, then at the clock on the wall behind him, as though checking whether there was still time for someone more credible to appear. There was not. He counted the bills twice, wrote her a receipt, stamped a deed of transfer with the county seal, and handed it across the counter with the expression of a man who expects to be explaining this transaction to his superiors before the week was out. Corinne folded the deed, placed it in her satchel beside her father's notebook, thanked Pritchett with genuine warmth, and walked out into the fog toward Calrow Point. She had $4 worth of Lighthouse and no idea what she was going to do with it, and the cold was settling into her bones the way it does when the body knows it has no shelter waiting. And she walked anyway, because the deed was warm in her pocket, and the causeway was ahead, and the lighthouse was hers. The causeway was worse than she had imagined. It had been built of fitted stone sometime in the 1870s, and 3 decades of Pacific weather had done their patient work on it, knocking stones loose, widening cracks, allowing the sea to claim the edges in irregular bites. She crossed it in the last of the gray afternoon light, picking her footing carefully, testing each stone before she trusted her weight to it. Arriving at the lighthouse's base, wet to the knee and cold through her coat and more alive than she had felt in weeks. The structure itself was a tapered cylinder of dressed granite rising perhaps 60 feet from the rock shelf at its base, with a wooden door at ground level that had warped in its frame and required her full weight against it before it swung open with a sound like a long-held breath, finally released. Inside was dark and cold and smelled of brine and old wood and something she could not name at first. Something faint and dry and papery, like the inside of a cabinet that has not been opened in years. She stood in the entry room and let her eyes adjust. The floor was stone. A spiral iron staircase wound up through the center of the tower. 3 narrow windows let in what remained of the evening light, and in that light she could see the accumulated proof of abandonment. Bird droppings on the sill, a rusted oil can on its side, a broken wooden crate, cobwebs across every corner and along the eastern wall. A small iron stove with a cracked firebox and a stack of split wood beside it that had dried too perfect tinder over however many seasons it had been sitting there, which turned out to be a mercy she had not earned but was grateful for. She built a fire in the stove with shaking hands, using the dry wood and 2 pages torn from the back of her own notebook where she had not yet written anything, because her father had taught her to take what the situation required before she worried about what she was losing. The fire caught. The stove radiated heat slowly, reluctantly, like a miser counting coins, but it was heat, and she pressed her back to it and ate the last of the biscuit she had carried in her coat pocket and tried to think practically. She would need water? The morning would tell her where the rain catchment was, if there was one. She would need to inspect the stairs. She would need to understand what she owned. She took the iron stairs carefully, testing each one, rising past the intermediate room where the keepers had once slept, a cot frame still there, rhymed with rust, a hook on the wall where a coat might have hung, and then up another full revolution of the staircase to the watchroom, which was bare of everything but a plank shelf running along the wall and the smell of cold salt air coming through. A cracked pane of glass. And then the last flight, shorter, steeper, the iron railing smooth where hands had gripped it for years, up to the beacon room at the top of the tower. The Fresnel lens was long gone, removed by the Lighthouse service when it decommissioned the station. But the lantern frame remained, a graceful iron structure with glass panels on all sides. And through those panels, the last of the day's light spread itself across the floor in pale rectangles. And in one of those pale rectangles, sitting on a built-in wooden shelf that ran along the curved interior wall, was a battered wooden box the size of a bread loaf, its lid secured with a brass latch gone green with and scratched into the lid in deep, deliberate letters, as though someone had pressed hard enough to be certain they would last. For whoever comes next, this is what I could not carry. Corinne stood looking at the box for a long time without touching it. The wind off the water pressed against the glass panels and made a low, continuous sound like a note held at the bottom of a pipe organ. She watched the last light drain from the sky beyond the glass and listened to the wind and thought about what it meant that someone had left something here on purpose, addressed to no one and everyone, in a room at the top of a tower that most people considered worthless. She thought it was probably the kind of thing that disappointed you when you opened it. An old lamp, a list of supplies, a record of weather observations in faded ink. She opened it anyway, because that was the kind of person she was, and because her father had taught her that a thing sealed is a question, and a question deserves an honest attempt at an answer. Inside the box, nested in a piece of oilcloth that had kept it dry through all the years the lighthouse had sat empty, were 3 items. The first was a hand-drawn map on heavy paper, a map of the Pelican Spit Harbor and the land surrounding it, drawn with considerable precision, annotated in a small, even hand, with property lines marked and numbered and cross-referenced to a column of names along the right margin. The second was a ledger, cloth-bound, its spine cracked but its pages intact, filled from cover to cover with the same small handwriting entries dated from 1881 through 1893, recording transactions, names, figures, property descriptions, transfers of title. The third was a letter, folded once and sealed with a blob of wax that had cracked but held, addressed in that same hand to any honest person who finds this. Keeper Emmett Aldis's Cowrow Point Light, Pelican Spit, Oregon. December 14, 1893. She read the name twice. Then she sat down on the cold floor of the beacon room and read it a third time, very slowly. The way you read something when you need to be certain you have not invented it. Aldis's, the same name as her father, the same name as her. She broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. It had been written by a man named Emmett Aldis, who identified himself as the lighthouse keeper at Cowrow Point from 1879 to 1893, and who also, in the careful and apologetic language of someone who has spent a long time deciding whether to write something down, identified himself as the younger brother of a man named Harold Aldis, who had been Thomas and Warren Aldis's father, which made Emmett Corinne's great-uncle a man she had never heard named in any family conversation. A man who had apparently been erased from the family's account of itself with the same thoroughness that Warren had applied to her father's estate. Emmett wrote that in the late 1870s and through the 1880s, he had witnessed and, he admitted, with evident shame, initially been complicit in a systematic scheme carried out by a land speculator named Reginald Couch and an attorney named Morser to manipulate the property records of the Pelican Spit Harbor District. Couch had acquired land cheaply by exploiting the confusion in the county's early surveying records, filing false claims, altering descriptions in the official ledgers, and pressuring small landholders to accept settlements for land that was already legally theirs. Emmett had served as a notary for several of these transactions before he understood what he was participating in. And when he understood it, he had begun keeping a private record, the ledger now in Corinne's hands, of every transaction. He could reconstruct or document, including the original property descriptions, the names of the families who had been displaced, and the evidence of what had been done to them. He had planned to take the ledger to the state land office. He had been afraid. Couch was powerful, and Morse was connected, and Emmett was a lighthouse keeper with no money and no allies. He had waited for the right moment for years while the entries in the ledger accumulated and the families of Pelican Spit adjusted themselves slowly and painfully to the new shape of what they owned and did not own. And then, in the winter of 1893, when a young man from Couch's office had come to the lighthouse on what was described as a routine inspection, but had spent an hour looking at shelves and surfaces with more attention than an inspector gives to surfaces, Emmett had understood that his record-keeping had been noticed. He could not carry the ledger safely out. The roads were watched, or he believed they were, which amounted to the same thing for a frightened man. He had wrapped the ledger in oilcloth, packed it with the map he had drawn over years of patient observation, written the letter, locked it in the box, carried it to the beacon room, and placed it on the shelf. Then he had taken his personal belongings and walked away from the lighthouse without being officially relieved of his post, which was itself a violation, which was why the lighthouse service had struck his name from the records. He had died in 1897, in Portland, without speaking publicly about any of it. He had written, "At the close of the letter, I was not brave enough to do what needed to be done. Perhaps you will be." The people whose names are in that ledger had things taken from them that they deserved to have back, or at least to have acknowledged. A ledger does not lie, even when the man who reads it does. Please use this well. Corinne sat in the cold beacon room for a very long time after she finished reading, the letter in her lap. The harbor of Pelican Spit spread below her in the darkness, its lights small and scattered in the fog. She thought about her father's saying, which she now understood had been passed down from somewhere deeper in the family than she had known. She thought about the names in the ledger. She thought about what it meant that a great-uncle she had never met had written, across 30 years of silence, a sentence she had been carrying on the first page of her notebook since she was 12 years old. She did not cry. She was past crying. She opened the ledger to the first page and began to read it in the last of the firelight from the stairwell below. And she did not stop until she had read every entry. And by the time she finished, the sky outside the glass panels had gone from black to the deep blue of early morning. And she knew exactly what she was going to do. The problem was that knowing and doing are separated by the distance between a thought and a consequence, and the consequences in this case were considerable. Corinne spent 2 days in the lighthouse before she showed the ledger to anyone, using the time to cross-reference Emmett's entries against the map, to organize the transactions chronologically, and to identify which families named in the ledger were still represented in Pelican Spit and which had left. She was methodical and careful because she understood that a document presented sloppily is a document more easily dismissed. And she had seen enough of how men like Warren and Couch operated to know that the first defense against evidence is to discredit the person presenting it. On the third day, she walked into town and asked to speak with the editor of the Pelican Spit Courier, a man named Harlow Betts, who turned out to be a vigorous, sharp-eyed man in his 60s, who had been editing the paper since before some of his readers had been born, and who had, she was relieved to discover, a deep and long-standing personal dislike of Reginald Couch. Couch was still alive, still powerful. still maintaining his offices in the harbor district on land whose chain of title Emmett's ledger called into serious question. Couch's attorney, Morsay, had died in 1901, which Betts said made things both easier and more complicated. Betts read the ledger for 4 hours without speaking, occasionally making notes on the margins of his own notepad. When he finished, he looked at Corin across his desk with an expression she had not seen directed at her from an adult man before, which was the expression of someone who has just recognized that the person across from them is more capable than they appeared at first, and is recalibrating accordingly. "You understand," he said, "that Couch will come after you personally when this becomes public." "He can try," she said. "I have lived in a lighthouse for 3 days and I have $4 and a ledger that documents his crimes. He has less to threaten me with than he thinks." Betts looked at her for another long moment. "Your father was Thomas Aldis's," he said. It was not a question. She told him yes. She told him about Warren. She told him about the deed of transfer she had never consented to, and the solicitor's letter, and the $4, and the auction notice on the post office board. She told him about her father's saying. When she finished, Betts sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a while, and then said that he was going to need to bring in a land attorney from Portland and that this was going to take some months, and she said she understood, and she walked back to the lighthouse through the fog and built a fire in the stove and made an entry in her notebook. Day 3. The ledger is in good hands. We begin. What followed was not fast, and it was not easy. And Couch had indeed come after her, first through his remaining attorney and then through the county tax office, which was persuaded to declare the lighthouse a public nuisance on the grounds that its causeway was unsafe and the structure should be condemned. She spent 3 weeks fighting the condemnation order, which Betts covered in the Courier with an attention to detail that made the tax office reconsider its position. Couch sent 2 men to the causeway one evening when the fog was thick, and they spent an hour on the rocks before the tide came in and persuaded them that the lighthouse was more trouble than it was worth. And she watched from the beacon room with a lantern and her father's folding knife and the particular stillness of someone who has already lost everything and therefore has very little left to fear. She was 19 years old and she was afraid, underneath the stillness, but the fear did not reach her hands, which were steady when she needed them to be. The land attorney from Portland was a woman named Clara Folds, which surprised no one. Who knew Clara Folds, but surprised almost everyone who met her for the first time, because the assumption in 1903 was that attorneys were men, and Clara Folds had spent 20 years being the exception to that assumption with a patience and precision that had made her one of the most effective land lawyers on the Oregon coast. She arrived in Pelican Spit in January of 1904 on the morning stage, read the ledger in the same 4 hours Betts had, and told Corinne that she had enough for a state-level inquiry and possibly a civil recovery action on behalf of the displaced families, provided those families could be located and were willing to participate. Locating them took the better part of the winter. Corinne did the work herself, going house to house in Pelican Spit and writing letters to the addresses she could trace for those who had left, explaining what had been found and what it might mean. Some people did not believe her. Some people were afraid. Some people had moved so far and built new lives so carefully around the shape of what they had lost that they did not wish to reopen the wound. She did not press them. She wrote down the names of those who said yes and thanked the ones who said no and kept walking. By March, she had 23 families willing to be named in the action. Clara Folds filed in April. Reginald Couch died in September of 1904, 2 weeks before the state inquiry's preliminary findings were released, of a heart failure that his physician attributed to the accumulated stresses of age and litigation. The inquiry found substantial evidence of fraudulent conveyance in 14 of the 23 cases, recommended recovery proceedings in 11, and referred the evidence of Morse's notarial fraud to the State Bar posthumously, for whatever comfort that provided. The Pacific Coastal Land Association, which had purchased the Aldises' estate from Warren, among other properties, was found to have been capitalized in part with proceeds from Couch's original fraudulent transactions, which created a complicated and eventually productive legal argument that Clara Folds pursued with the methodical pleasure of a craftsman given good material to work with. Warren Aldises was not prosecuted. There was insufficient direct evidence to establish that he had known the provenance of the Pacific Coastal Land Association funds, and he maintained to the end that he had acted in his niece's best interest, and that the estate had been genuinely encumbered by debt. What happened to him was quieter and, in its way, more thorough. The state inquiry's public records established the circumstances of the trust dissolution in full legal detail. And Portland was a city whose professional community had a long memory. And Warren found that the social ease with which he had formerly moved through it contracted, over the following years, to something much smaller and less comfortable. He did not speak to Corinne again. She did not seek him out. In the late spring of 1905, the state recovery proceedings returned clear title to 7 of the 11 families. With monetary compensation from the Couch estate for the others, it was not everything that had been taken. It was more than anyone in Pelican Spit had believed possible 2 years before. At the gathering bets organized on the harbor quay to mark the outcome, a simple afternoon affair with coffee and bread and the particular quiet dignity of people who have been through something hard. Together, Corinne stood at the edge of the crowd and watched the families whose names had been in Emmett's ledger receive their documents, and she understood that this was what her great-uncle had wanted, not credit, not vindication, just the names where they belonged, and the land returned to the people who had been its rightful stewards. Clara Folds, working separately from the recovery action, established that the Aldises Trust had been mismanaged in ways that, while falling short of criminal fraud, constituted a clear breach of fiduciary duty, and recovered a settlement from Warren that covered Corinne's expenses and provided a sum sufficient to restore the Lighthouse Causeway, which she did, 1 stone at a time over the following summer, hiring 2 local men who knew stonework and working beside them herself on the days when the weather allowed, because she had decided that Calrow Point Light was her home, and that homes required maintenance, and that she was the kind of person who did not outsource what she could learn. We think, sometimes, about the particular quality of a locked box left by someone who has lost their nerve but not their conscience. There is something in it that is both a failure and a gift, the failure of the person who could not carry the truth forward in their own lifetime, and the gift they left for whoever came after. For whoever was desperate enough or curious enough or simply stubborn enough to climb to the top of a tower that everyone else had written off and open the thing inside. Emmett Aldises had lived with what he knew for 12 years and had not been brave enough to do anything with it except preserve it, which is a partial cowardice, but also, in the end, a kind of faith that the right person would come along, that the ledger would wait, that the truth is patient in a way that people sometimes are not. Corinne Aldises was 19 years old and homeless, and she had $4, and she bought a lighthouse because the notice was on the board and the price was what she had. That is not wisdom. That is not strategy. That is the arithmetic of a person with nothing left to lose and a direction to walk in. But she had been taught to observe and to record and to distrust easy conclusions, and she had been taught that a ledger does not lie even when the man reading it does. And when she opened the box in the beacon room and found those 3 things nested in oilcloth and waiting, she did not use them to save herself. She used them to return what had been taken from 23 families, and she worked through a winter and a spring and part of a summer, with no guarantee of success and considerable personal risk, because the names in the ledger were not abstractions. To her, they were her neighbors. They were the people who had watched the same fog come in off the same harbor. They were the people who belonged to Pelican Spit the way the granite belonged to the headland, which is to say, permanently and without argument. There is a lighthouse on Calrow Point that still stands, its causeway mended, its lantern dark because the shipping lanes no longer require it. If you stood at the top of the tower on a clear morning, you would see the harbor of Pelican Spit below you in the pale light, and the water beyond it, and the hills behind the town still wearing their trees. You would see a harbor full of people living on land with clean title. You would see, if you knew where to look, the cedar house on the low hill that Corinne eventually purchased, not her father's house, which was gone, but a different house, equally solid, with bookshelves in every room and a kitchen garden visible from the road, planted in the soil her mother would have recognized, and in the beacon room. On the shelf where the box had been, there is a notebook. Not the original one, which Corinne kept to the end of her life. A copy of the first page, in handwriting close enough to her father's to be startling. In ink that has not faded, carrying a sentence that has now passed through 3 generations. The ledger never lies, Corey. But the man reading it might. We think about Corinne Aldis's. When we think about what it means to find value in something the world has abandoned, not the dramatic kind of value, not treasure, not gold, but the kind that was placed there by someone who needed it to survive and couldn't carry it forward alone. The kind that waits, patient and sealed in oilcloth, for whoever is desperate enough to come looking. The world is full of locked boxers on high shelves. Most of them are nothing. But some of them are everything, and the only way to know the difference is to climb up and look. Thank you, truly, for spending this time with us and with the story of Corinne Aldis. If this story found you at a moment when something felt unjust or out of reach, we hope it reminded you that patience and honest records have a long reach of their own, sometimes longer than the injustice they oppose. If you feel moved by what you heard today, please share this video with someone who might need it, and leave a comment. Because we read every one, and they matter more than you might think. We have one question to leave you with. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something that everyone else had written off? A place, a person, an idea, a skill? We would love to hear it. We are always grateful for your company in this quiet corner of the world. And until next time, stay close.